I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we are ready in Jans Kerkhof, Utrecht, and at home. And what we will do is have a final theorizing evening. And then the last slide tonight is the schedule of the tutorials in November, December, January. So that is the ultimate end point of today. And the topic is the LLM thesis, your LLM thesis. And what we try to achieve is that we synthesize, that we bring together the topics so far and apply them as much as possible to the tips and tricks where it comes to argumentation, storyline, structure, research question, and the corresponding expectations on our side summarized in this phrase assessment form. And the idea, like the first session, is that when I share with you our views on that, our ideas, our standards, our traditions, then you can write with those standards in your head already, as if you are your own assessor. And the ultimate spot on the horizon is that students write their thesis and assess that themselves with those criteria. So no secrets, and also opportunity to ask questions. And the assessment form is, as mentioned earlier, divided in a few categories, and you can group those categories. So we have 3 categories on the content, we have 3 categories on the form, as in structure, as in style, as in process, and we have as 7th seventh category, the argumentation itself. Then we zoom in today on the legal argumentation. So that is a sort of little tail of last week's rhetoric or the theory. Good evening, take a seat. The theory on arguing. And I have a proposition, a leading claim, a definition, and that is that when you understand the legal arguments, so the concepts related to that phrase, legal arguments, that understanding helps you to articulate a research question, to select sources and evidence, and streamline the thesis structure. So my claim is that there are 3 more reasons to get our heads around the whole idea of what do we mean with legal argumentation, and those are those 3 or 4 reasons. Welcome, take a seat. And I start with legal argumentation, then I move on to research question, then I move to sources, and then I move to structure. And this arrow is my evidence tonight that there is an actual assessment form, and the red arrow points at the category called argumentation. And the bullets are, we discussed that already, the sufficiency, the acceptability, very importantly, the individual analysis so that you do things yourself, that they are clear and coherent, then the catch-all bullet, knowledge of the field, and then 2 times context, 1 social, 1 academic. And the major advice and tip and claim today and now is that 99% of your grade is derived from the success in this category. But argumentation is related to research question, sources, and structure, meaning that we are not having 99% in our heads, we divide it a little bit over the other categories. But ultimately, for me, that's one cloud, and that justifies that I spent another 2 hours with you to see whether I can say things that make sense. Please bear in mind that based on the last 3 lectures, we have to conclude that the word argumentation means different things. And that, I say, is a spectrum. And on that spectrum, on the one end, argumentation means the whole story. So when you talk to people and they say your argumentation is weak, and then they could mean that the whole storyline is weak. Then synonyms of that sort of catch-all definition is the claims you make, the point you make. So this is on one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is one single point, as in the sky is blue. That is also argumentation. And each time that you communicate with yourself in your head, with your supervisor, with the assessment form, you have to be aware that each time the other party can have a different definition in his head. And especially when you theorize about it, I think you should make this very clear, that argumentation means many things, potentially. I'm not saying that it is a good thing, or that academia could solve this one day, but my empirical claim is that when I talk in the last 30 years with intelligent people, they are all over the place. And a nice intellectual word for all over the place is it's on a spectrum. And then somewhere between the whole story and one single argument, there are stations. Stations like arguments pertaining to facts, or reasoning that is typically legal, the case-solving thingy, which we will address in a minute, or value claims, as in, I think it's a right thing to abolish the European Union for these and these reasons. Okay. And then, to make things worse, I'm not sure whether in the communication and in the assessment form there's such a strict division between methods and argumentation. Because we defined, last lecture, we defined methods in 2 ways. One is the more narrow definition, being the process of collecting data. But we mentioned and we defined and we warned you that there's this all-encompassing definition, and that is that it is a description what type of piece you have written, with words like a legal doctrinal piece. Sounds like a method, but that is a description of the whole look and feel of the article or the LLM thesis. Or a empirical study, that is then a label that is not pertaining to the evidence pieces, but the whole approach. And one telling thing on the assessment form is that the category of methods is academic approach and method. So we leave it to you to choose. And you could claim, if these definitions are flying around, that the broadest definition of the word argumentation overlaps with the broadest definition of method. And that the narrowest definition of argumentation, being the one single argument, the sky is blue, that is the small definition of method. How do I know? Well, I have a inductive relationship with the sky, and I watch the sky for 10,000 years as humanity, and then we conclude it's still blue. So it's a true statement, a true argumentation, based on that method, that the sky is blue, as a single argument. And with your discussions with your supervisor, you will notice that sometimes you zoom in together on one page and you say, is this single argumentation making sense? In the analysis of a piece of case law or something like that. And then you're on the right side of the spectrum, and you have moments where you get feedback like, well, you have to work on your argumentation, which is Dutch academic language for give it another look in its totality. Okay. Let's move on to the more technical side of legal argumentation. And I have another proposition, and that is that both arguments in the broad and the narrow sense contain a minimum of 6 components in the legal domain. And I made a taxonomy. You know me in the meantime, so I like drawings and lists and grocery lists, etc., which could be translated to checklists for you. And that is the intention. And practical tip, address each component. So this is a moment where I do not mind that you make mental notes or paper notes, because this is intended not to only to be very theoretical, but also very practical. And if in each conversation you can put this X-ray on your writing, and you can indicate which of these, and we will discuss them one by one, that it is present, then at least you have a minimum of 6 components present. And the other practical tip is that in searching for a topic, take this grocery list in front of you and see whether you can enrich your thinking about a topic. Because one of those grocery lists is dealing with that. Okay, number 1. Oh, this is the big one. Let's start with the object. The object of the legal argumentation, so what your argumentation is about, can be 4 flavors. 1, you can dive into legal rules. 2, you can look at actors, as in governments, companies, private individuals, others. Or you could look into issues, as in environment, poverty, privacy, human rights, rule of law, innovation, stuff like that. And the average LLM thesis is taking all these 3 objects as its subject. And why are many conversations between students and supervisors sort of vague until half May? Because people are not making distinctions between those categories. And my advice is, take at least one rule somewhere, defines it as LLM, legal master, at least one actor, and at least one issue in a mixed approach. And make that explicit. Then we move on. That, especially in an international master, we have to deal with territories. Because either you deal with national stories, regional stories, also known as European Union or other regions, or internationally. And those are distinct components, as in that they come with, we will see later, different sources. And yes, I'm afraid that you will mix those 3. But make sure that each territory comes with the appropriate academic sources, traditions, etc. Let's phrase it in a different way. When you have a LLM thesis on a national topic, then you speak national lawyer language. When you take European law as an ingredient, then you speak Brusselish, which is distinct from national jurist language. As in, what do you abbreviate or what not? Example, the word European Union. In a EU LLM thesis, it's rather strange in the introduction to say in the European Union bracket, EU bracket. No. In the EU we have technology. Because in Brusselish there's no such thing as European Union not abbreviated in a sort of academic sense. And internationally speaking, you're not abbreviating the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union because you have this Vienna Treaty on the Treaties in mind. So you say the Treaty of Rome, registered in the United Nations, that is sort of public international language about the same thingy. And one of the discussions I quite often have with students is that when you start mixing that, everybody's sort of confused. And my solution is that you tell, in this chapter, you tell the things 3 times. That you say, from a national perspective, we call this fundamental rights. From a European or constitutional rights. From a European perspective, we talk about the Charter. And from an international perspective, we talk about the International Covenant on Human Rights and stuff like that. So that you are addressing those. And thirdly, what you are producing is level. And there are 3 levels. There are many levels. I mentioned 3. Sort of entry level, expert level, and virtuoso level. And virtuoso is PhD, you create new questions. And expert level is something we expect from you. As in, you talk to an intelligent audience. And then there is a sort of debate that also actors outside the university should benefit from it. And that you have a sort of intention to translate it to something tangible for normal people. And I don't see a solution to that problem. Because if you make it too down to earth and practical and understandable for normal actors, then Utrecht University thinks that you're not clever enough. And if there is no practical application or recommendation or advice at the end of the road, then we think that you're in an ivory tower. So it's quite difficult to do it the right way. And one step is that you are aware of it. The second step is that you make that explicit, as in final chapter, subchapter on advices or recommendations, that you say, well, in normal language, this means that businesses should stop doing this and this. And then the more intellectual version is that a reasonable interpretation of the applicable law brings with it that there are potentially legal consequences for actors who are infringing the law, which doesn't sound very understandable for normal businesses or consumers, but is then the more academic version of the same sentence. Then there's something with audiences. And the audience has 2 sort of components. One, there's this audience that you directly address, as in the supervisor, or as in the metaphor that we create a scholarly article or a journal article. Then in the general practice, or the general interest practice, we operate as a role play, and then the technical audience are other scholars. However, the whole idea of any profession, including the legal profession, is that society advances based on our work. So behind your supervisor there are real people you are writing for, as in that the message of your argumentation, in the broad sense of the word, affects the legal system, and the legal system affects human beings, or businesses, or states. And you are capable to make that explicit, to mention in the course of your argumentation, in the course of your story, that, and preferably in the realm of the research question, that your story is especially affecting consumers or businesses or their relationship or stuff like that. So there is no such thing as law in general. It's always law in relationship to real actors out there. And I prefer that we keep that abstract, so private, commercial, governmental, and a reserve category if you're not one of the three, including Amnesty International and Greenpeace and the like. And then the species. This is Aristotle talking. What type of story do you write? And he introduced, and we never improved that, he introduced a framework with past, present, future. And when you write about a past event, that's called forensic, and since you're not in litigation, there's no dead body or sort of real interaction, so an academic piece about something in the past results in a judgment that our colleagues did the right thing or not the right thing in the past. The present category is complicated, so we skip that and move to the future. And that, in Aristotle's words, is called deliberation, and that is something 100% of you will do. And it's worthwhile to ask yourself, what is deliberation about? And that is my research matrix, that you describe the past, that you explain the past, and that you make a forecast from the past to the future. And then you predict that a certain legal actor issue situation will occur. And then deliberation is about those three things I mentioned, that you either say, well, it is okay, this future, so cope with it, deal with it. Or you say it's not okay, and then you say to your audience, please change. Or you're an innovator and you can say, when we transform the whole bit, that is also an option for future behavior. So, since legal texts are quite often a mix of the three, my bottom line advice and theorizing is that you should make that clear. Where? In your structure. And then a logical order is that you start in the past, that you are in the present with your prediction, and that you then move to the deliberation. And that is quite often a natural chapter structure of an average LLM thesis. Obviously, you're the chief of the text, and there are multiple roads to Rome. So you can, in the introduction, already tell what you will tell. So I'm not saying that you're not allowed to mix up those perspectives, let's call it that way, but please make them explicit in a fluent, beautiful way. And then you will have a position. And this is something I like to emphasize, because either law is okay, you're in favor, or the system or the historical development says it's good, or it is not good, And then theoretically there's a position that is then called neutral, but I don't think that there's such a thing as neutrality in terms of law. Example, judges are not allowed not to render a judgment. Then they're fired. And one of the role models of our profession is the judge. And I'm thinking about this for 30 years, and I'm growing to the point that I say there is no such thing as neutrality. But we also labeled the LLM thesis as objective legal writing. And that brings on the table the question, is there a similarity between the word objective and the word neutrality? And there are two answers. One answer is that you say it's a synonym. And the other answer is that we should not look at the definitions of those words. We should look at what is the intention. One, we are the general interest practice, so we are not paid by a company or a state or a private individual to say what they want to hear. So academic or objective or neutral in the sense that it is the truth you are telling. But law is a slippery topic in the sense that it channels the behavior of actors in the direction society wants. We know pretty well what the society wants. And the law is there to have a position, to have that artificial mechanism effect. So that cannot be neutral. So I think only journalists who write travel guides can be neutral. And travel to Norway and say, I see a mountain. Beautiful. That in my eyes is neutrality. And then, most of you will mobilize hermeneutics of suspicion. You will build in your argumentation that there's something rotten in Denmark and that there are misunderstandings and that we should correct them. Most of you are enrolled in a master program with these types of emotions, which is good. And that is the opposite of neutrality. But it's not a political piece, it's about the argumentation. So you will have the facts talk on your behalf. And that means that the options are back to pro or contra, if neutrality doesn't exist in this sense. And I think that a student is serving his or her interest by deciding in advance in which camp you are. Because there's nothing so confusing to continue to think, well, I don't know whether GDPR is okay or not. Because that is basically saying, I don't know how it functions. So my tip, in the upcoming months, when we dive in a concrete research question of your thesis and a topic, experiment with a position and say, okay, next 4 weeks I'm contra. Because the good news is that on June the 30th, it's timely enough to make up your mind. So your position now is not binding, but it helps to define the research question, to find sources, because then you know who you're talking to. Because with a position, you enrich and you sharpen your idea about who is who. Because the position results in the definition, these are my friends and these are my opponents. If you have no position, then you think everybody is happy, dancing, and then you're sort of in the cloud. So as a method, presume that you have a position. And that sharpens in this stage already your thinking, is my experience. Okay, so those were the 6. Let's go back. So on the left side you have the object, the territory and the level. And on the left side you have the audience, the species and the position. Your grocery list for tonight and the upcoming weeks. And then the argumentation in the strict sense of the word. And then we are back in week 2, that philosophy of science or scholarship or research industry recognizes 5 flavors. Deduction, induction, abduction, also known as the hypothetic deductive method, hermeneutics of recovery and hermeneutics of suspicion. And I add the 6th flavor for people who are unhappy with those 5. Good luck finding it. So ultimately, your arguments in the strict sense of the word are one of these. And then, like with the other flavors, you most likely come up with a mix. But please be aware that ultimately, if you put everything in a blender, then the smoothie is very ugly. And I would say, make your life simple. Legal reasoning in the strict sense of the word, so rule, issue, rule, application, conclusion, that thingy, that is 100% deductive. Deductive, because the rule is given. Facts in society are more inductive, as in statistics, figures, reports on unhappy people in access to justice, whatever. And that is typically empirical. And then your research question is most likely abductive, sort of hypothesis. What if this part of the rule changes in the light of these facts? And when I reason it through, what would happen? And my tip, my advice, my suggestion is experiment in demarcating those flavors along the chapter. So in terms of the research question, that you basically say, this could be described as a abductive or hypothetic deductive method. In chapter 2, where I describe the legal environment, I will move to a deductive reasoning, as in rules, facts, conclusions. Then in my 3rd chapter, I will mobilize the issues in society, which will have a inductive, also known as empirical character. And then in my 4th question, I come to a answer to my research question, which is then a sort of synthesis, which comes from another realm, Hegel, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, very dominant language in academia. So, argumentation as interim conclusion is the most important category. The assessment form has already 2 spots where it is addressed, and it is hidden in the research question, the sources, the structure, etc. My taxonomy is just a grocery list to keep 6 components very clear on your radar. For instance, on the point in the discussion, whether you have to present a topic, a issue, or a question, and whether that is 3 different things. And I think you offer in your introduction all 3. And then there is a societal issue. There is a question of an actor. And you will say, as a Roman emperor, whether a piece of legislation or case law is okay or not okay, which is a value judgment. Aristotle calls the last 50 minutes the chapter on logos. So last week we had ethos, logos, pathos, and whatever is connected to argumentation, to methods, to the truth, to the facts, that is in the Aristotle chapter of logos. Let's move to the next one, in the same proposition, as in that I claim that understanding legal arguments, in the broad sense of the word, helps articulating a research question. Let's take that one on the table right now. And the research question is the first category of the assessment form, with bullets like independent, explicit, feasible, precise, thorough, relevant, and sub-questions. And I claim here that, yes, that it keeps you busy until the end. And the end is June 30th, 2022. Because there will be a moment that based on your research question, you dive into academic information gathering, as the assessment form calls it. You collect data, you start writing, you start developing a storyline, a lineup of arguments, and then you, in May, starts to understand your topic. And that's the first moment that you drastically revise the research question. And then, most of you are too ambitious, so then halfway of June you discover that half of your research question is not covered with actual research activities. And then you do the haircut move. You just delete that part of the research question. And you tell nobody, and then it looks like that it was perfect as from the start. But in this phase, and in the tutorials, we will try to beat you, not physically, to already think ahead, to look at this criteria of feasibility. We mentioned that earlier. A research question to collect data in 27 member states and then do a comparative law analysis with 50 states of the United States of America and the states of the Republic of India and the 7 states of Australia. That is not feasible in terms of time. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have questions like, what is the future of law and technology in Europe? And that's also not feasible, because that is something that's sort of mission statement of an individual to deal with in the next 4 decades, etc. Okay, I promised that the thinking of legal argumentation helps to sharpen legal research questions. And that comes with 6 options. So I have another grocery list for you. Here it comes. So the research question can deal with the application of a specific rule, as in rule of law. And then the GDPR is not a rule, but Article 999 is a rule. Paragraph 1, bullet 2. That's a rule. And then such a research question is, how does such an article work out for consumers in situation X? And here you could apply already the framework of the 6 components of legal argument. Because here we talk about a rule on European level. You have an intention to do it on the expert level. The audience is apparently consumers. Then the species is deliberation on the future. How will this be in the future? And most likely you are in favor of the consumer and against the bad guys called Facebook and Google, although you half of you work there. Because that's sort of the emotion until you will be an entrepreneur yourself. Then all of a sudden you start bossying around your employees and stuff like that. And then send me Christmas card. Secondly, the research question could be perceived or framed or understood as an advice of a particular actor. How should the platforms, online platforms, behave in the light of freedom of speech? Then it is about the actor that needs to be well, at the centerpiece of your deliberations, which, in terms of the 6 components, is then a choice for that object. Thirdly, research question could explicitly deal with an issue as in object, not being a legal rule, not being an actor, but the environment damaged by search engines using electricity in those plants. And what is then the advice and the tip for all these 3 flavors so far? That you should combine them. Because if it is just about the issue, then there's a risk that the legal framework is sort of evaporating. So the concrete tip is that these 3 flavors which I connect to the object in my component taxonomy can better be combined as of the start, rather than that half of May your supervisor asks, and which part of the law are you intending to review? In that sense, I mean it sort of concrete. And then the research question, especially in the realm of hermeneutics of suspicion, that the Big Five is having a sort of cartel conspiracy to blow up capitalism and do beautiful or terrible things, or with robots, you know. Then the research question is already linked or pointing at a certain position. And this is always a question mark, because you do not know yet, and it feels not academic. But most of you implicitly have chosen, and you can, as a supervisor, see that in the research question. How do you avoid it? With phrases like yes or whether yes or no, it is the case that. And then you make it explicit that you do not know yet. But you leave the option open explicitly, and you help yourself in terms of structure. Oh, I have to decide whether it is yes or no, because that was in the research question. And then most research questions start as a sort of deliberation phrase. As my example, what is the future of law and technology in Europe? That's sort of typical deliberation language. And I claim that that is also a helpful component, but should not be the only component, because it feels, you know, not concrete. And the bottom line, basically, is that I advise you to put all 6 components in one question. And if it doesn't fit, then you put it in sub-questions. And maybe the whole idea of sub-questions is that one is the main question and the other 5 are 5 sub-questions. But in most research questions, 3 or 4 of those elements are already in. And now they have a sort of number, you know, or a label. So the whole point of tonight is that each word you write down has a purpose and a sort of background. So it's not just prose that sort of bubbles up, but it's sort of deliberate design. You know, you're an architect. We talk about foundations. We talk about skeletons. And we need all the bones. And then you can start writing and studying. Well, this is basically what I just said. Combine those and anticipate which type of argumentation belongs to each component. And that means that in abstracto you can already write your whole thesis without knowing the content. Because the main sentences you already know based on your ideal research question. In terms of the objects, plural, in terms of the territories, plural, in terms of the level, in terms of the species, the audience, the position. And that means that you could write the first lines of each chapter already. And you can write the first paragraph of your conclusion already, before you know what your thesis was about. Because you know that in this thesis, in the conclusion, chapter 5, was at stake rule, and then you put in XXX because you do not know yet which rule, in relation to activities of actor YYY, in issue ZZZ, etc., etc. And that sort of streamlines, we will discover after the break, the structure and the sources. Search for sources. So this was the first leg. For the first time, somehow within the 45 minutes, which is in the schedule. So I'm improving. So let's have 13 minutes, fresh air, smoke, and all other terrible things. See you in a bit.